morning, everyone. Welcome back to Hocking Valley Community Hospital's 55 Ways to a Better Me. So excited and happy to have Tim McDermott back, and he's going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, which is chickens and backyard, keeping them in the coops and et cetera, et cetera. So I'll just move into this quickly because I'm sure he has a lot of information to share with us today. So Tim, welcome back.
Thanks, Latricia. When we last talked, we talked about gardening and how there was explosive growth in the number of people that wanted to learn how to grow their own food secondary to COVID. And I will tell you, we had a matching amount of people that look to keep their own backyard poultry for the same reason. Poultry can provide your own source of protein from eggs or from meat. And we had the same challenges. Literally, chick season sold out of every chick. I knew people that had to drive counties away to get birds, and hatcheries ran out. We had a run on birds, which is a good thing. I think keeping backyard poultry is a great way to know where your food comes from, and that's whether you're just keeping them in your backyard for a few layers, or whether you want to do some meat birds or a 4-H youth project. But that's important that you figure out what your purpose is before you get your birds, because different birds are elite at doing different things. There are certain birds that are absolutely elite at being a meat bird. They grow to that harvestable size in a short period of time. They maximize feed efficiency. Same thing with egg production. There are birds that they are egg producing factories, and they will put eggs out at a rapid pace. A lot of people in the backyard community get a dual purpose bird. That is a bird that is going to produce eggs for you, but will also over time reach a nice harvestable size so that you can have both products. And then I did a class last night for a 4-H community club for backyard poultry. There's a tremendous increase in the number of 4-H youth that are keeping poultry projects. Now that could be chickens. Increasingly, we're seeing turkeys as well. And so show breeds are another way that people will keep their backyard birds. So, but when we want to do this, we need to talk the talk here, or else people on the internet will make fun of you. So when you're talking chickens, you want to know you got a hen and a rooster, which we know. A baby chicken is a chick. A pullet is an immature female chicken. She hasn't come into start laying yet. A cockerel is an immature male chicken. And when we talk turkeys, males are toms, females are hens, and babies are poults. So this is something Latricia and I were talking about right before we started. Know the regulations of where you live, because some places allow birds, some places don't. There is no standardization that I have seen, and I have spoken all over the entire state of Ohio. And in fact, last night's class was for a 4-H club in Wyoming, the state of Wyoming. Different regulations everywhere. So check where you live to find out what your regulations are before you buy your birds. And then where you get your birds are important. I recommend that you get your birds from a hatchery that is NPI approved, NPIP approved, and we'll talk about that. Or wherever you buy live birds, they got it from an NPIP approved hatchery. And you want to have all your housing and your food and your water and stuff ready to go. This isn't like getting a puppy where you can buy the puppy, go to the pet shop, buy a spangly collar, buy a bunch of food. When you order chicks from a hatchery, there's a reason I have a FedEx box there. They mail them to you in the mail as day-old chicks. And so you need to get those chicks and get that box open and get them in an environment that is ready to go for them right away. So what NPIP is the National Poultry Improvement Plan. It was established in the 1930s by the government. Our poultry industry looked vastly different then than it does now. In fact, pretty much everybody kept backyard birds. Salmonella pylori was a disease that was very impactful in a negative way to chickens, up to 80% mortality. So NPIP was established to test and eliminate through vaccination pylori disease. And now it actually also targets voluntarily a couple other salmonellas, a bunch of mycoplasmas, and high-path avian influenza. But getting it from an NPIP-approved hatchery means that they are sourcing their breeding stock and they're doing testing and vaccination, trying to make sure that the birds that you get from them are the healthiest birds you can get, which a healthy start is going to provide a greater opportunity for a healthy life with these birds. So you get your birds, they show up in a box, you pop the box open, you need to brood your chicks, or if you get them from some other place, a Tractor Supply or Rural King or some other store like that. A brooder is a clean, dry, warm, ventilated space that you've sterilized prior, like at least a week or so, so that any fumes from cleaning chemicals have evaporated, right? Shipping livestock is stressful. They're already predisposed to respiratory disease from being shipped. Don't put them in a place with bad air quality. You need to have adequate space for the birds to move around. This is where I like a nice clean dry litter that you can use. We'll talk about litter choices later. This is about the only time that I like small particles potentially for them, but you want to have a little bit of litter in there because baby chick legs are basically like little plastic toothpicks and they're very fragile, and you want to avoid any injury to that. You want to have your brooder pre-warmed, okay? They need to go into their warm space, and you start at 90 to 95 degrees, and that is measured at 2 inches tall, because that's how tall a baby chick is about. I like those old metal oven thermometers, you know, that you used to put actually in the oven. That's basically the same size as a baby chick. Put it right under the heat lamp so that you know exactly where your temperature is. And then you decrease the heat 5 degrees per week and you measure. Make sure that you are double securing your heat lamp. Don't just hang it by the cord, because you don't want it to break off and fall into a brooder, which is a tinderbox full of baby chicks. It takes about 6 weeks in the brooder for chicks to grow into where they're going to be transitioned out of the brooder and off of a starter feed. And you want to monitor those chicks carefully, meaning you want to make sure that you are observing their behavior. They are going to cluster together if they're cold. They might move away from the heat lamp if it's too hot. You want to make sure they're eating, drinking, peeing, and pooping, doing things that baby chicks do. They're active and alert, because this is the most fragile time in their life. And they, you know, fully grown chickens are not necessarily the hardiest of species in general, right? They reproduce themselves every single day. So keep in mind that baby chicks are the fragile life stage of a fairly fragile species in general. So do you need a rooster? For egg production, you do not need a rooster. That layer is going to make eggs regardless. Only fertilized eggs are needed in terms of having a rooster. Keep in mind that a lot of places don't allow roosters. A lot of municipalities don't want them in there. They can be aggressive, they can be noisy, so you need to make sure you can verify that you can even have them. If you are buying your chicks from either a hatchery or wherever you're getting them, if you don't want roosters, make sure you request hens. If you ask for straight run, then basically you get what you get and you don't throw a fit. You could buy 10 straight run chicks. Sexing a baby chick is not the easiest thing to do. I can't do it. People at hatcheries can do it. But you might have 10 roosters out of those 10 if the dice roll that way. If you go to, say, a store and you're going to buy chicks that they've already got there, they're maybe a day, 2 days old, about a week old or something like that, you're going to see that they have different choices. I was at the Tractor Supply in Carroll just about a week or so ago buying some things for my garden, and they had a fairly decent selection of birds. They had about 6 or 8 different birds there. They had some layers and some meat birds and some show birds, and they were all straight run. And then they had a cage of sex-linked birds. And when you see that term, what that means is this: avian genetics are different than mammalian genetics. And they have found over time that if you breed together a different species, and they have different species that they breed that way, when the chicks are born, their sex is determined by the color of the chick. And so that allows you to quickly figure out if you want to have a layer or not. There's red sex linked and there's black sex linked. They're not elite. They're closer to a dual purpose bird, right? Because you've done a couple of hybrids together with that. But if you want to make sure you're getting layers when you buy your birds and not getting a bunch of roosters, if you want to establish a layer flock and you're buying your birds in person, if you see sex linked, the color is going to be determining the sex based on how they were bred together, depending on what species they bred. So let's talk about care and feeding and watering of birds. So the number one most important nutrient part of their diet is water. They need a source of clean, fresh water every single day. You need to be checking it. I tell 4-H youth, check it twice per day because birds are messy and water is fail. And water is the enemy of the coop. If you have a water that is leaking or dripping into the bedding, that's going to cause a problem down the line. They also need the water for thermoregulation. They cool off like dogs. They're going to pant. They need to drink more water in the heat. They drink more water depending on if they're aggressively growing or aggressively in lay as well. Eggs are 1/3 water. So I tell when I do this class for 4-H youth, I say check the water twice a day. Make sure they have some in the morning when they start, clean and fresh, and make sure that they have some when you get toward the end of the day, because a hen will drink 25% of her body weight in the last chunk of daylight. 3 different water sort of situations here. I don't like feeders or waterers that sit on the ground. I mean, when you have a chick, you kind of have to do that because they're 2 inches tall. But when you have older birds, I like them suspended up in the air, and that keeps them from being contaminated by insects, by vermin, by the birds themselves. They are super messy. They will back right up to that water and poop in it. They will scoop their feed into it. They'll scoop their litter into it. So up off the ground is good. If you have a bunch of birds, this is an inline system and it plugs right into a PVC pipe that's feeding water. It's got a float. When the float goes all the way up, the water stops flowing into the cup, the birds drink, the float goes down, and it refills that. This is a nice one in terms of using like a small flock where you want to do water. A 5-gallon bucket, then you buy these little nipple contraptions and you drill a hole in here, and they have a gasket that keeps them from leaking. I like the clear bucket because you can see right away if there's anything floating in there and how much the water level is. And then basically when they peck at these, a little dribble of water comes out and they can drink that way. I will say, if you're getting birds, start with whatever their watering system is going to be when they're chicks, because kind of changing acutely when they're older, they might not pick up on it. You might even have to have both systems in there until you've noticed that all the birds have figured out both systems, if you're going to say change from a on the ground water to a suspended water. So feeding is very important. When we talk about poultry, different ages and different intended uses of poultry require different feed mixes with different nutrients and minerals added. And this is one of the more unique species in that if they're not fed exactly to what they need to have for their intended use, it can actually have serious medical implications that way. Store your feed in a rodent-proof container, because basically poultry feed is something that everything on the planet would love to eat. Generally, it's a grind of corn and soybeans, and then all of the essential macro and micronutrients and vitamins and minerals are added to that to make a complete feed. And then I like this feeder the same way I like that other waters that were off the ground, right? Very sturdy, heavy duty plastic. You could put this in the dishwasher to sterilize it periodically. She can't knock it over because it's up in the air. She can't scoop the food out onto the ground and waste it. It's right at the level she can put her beak in there and feed. It's off the ground to prevent insects and vermin from crawling into it. So I like a suspended feeder because it's a little bit more efficient in terms of feed management, as well. It is going to be less able to be contaminated by the bird. So when we get our chicks, especially, we're in the brooder, we're at least 5 weeks, maybe 6 weeks in there, we're feeding them chick starter. And what chick starter is specially formulated for chicks, tinier pieces of the crumble so that they can eat it, a little higher in protein because they're in a fast growth phase. And then it is medicated with a coccidiostat, and that is to prevent coccidia, which is a protozoal parasite that can really negatively affect chickens. So pretty much every species, including people, get coccidia. We all have our more sort of susceptible time period when we're younger as our immune systems are developing. And then once our immune systems become competent, we can deal with the occasional coccidial encounter. Chickens have 7 different coccidias that affect them. They need to actually develop immune system responses to all of them. And so when you feed this, you feed a low level of a coccidiostat, which allows them to be exposed to it develop an immune system response without having serious medical complications. Because chickens are one of the 4 species that actually can really negatively be impacted medically by coccidia. That is chickens, that is bunny rabbits, puppy dogs, and small ruminants, including goats. All 4 of those seem to have more problems with coccidia than other species. So one thing to note is do not feed to layer hens, not enough calcium, very little calcium in there, just enough for the growing bones of a baby chick, but not enough to do growing bones and eggs at the same time. And then you have a grower feed. You feed until sexual maturity, which is 20 to 22 weeks when a layer comes into harvest, or you feed that grower and maybe a grower finisher feed until a bird is harvested for meat. Broilers are harvested for meat anywhere from about 8 weeks, maybe 10 weeks. They're still baby chicks at that point. They're not going to get to sexual maturity before they're harvested. And this is basically the feed that you feed from starter until they go into lay or they go into the freezer. You want to make sure people do a lot of treats with whatever pet or species that they're growing. That's horses, that is your Labrador, that is also backyard poultry. We're seeing a lot more people keep backyard poultry, and we're seeing them keeping them as sort of this hybrid pet that gives you food, because poultry are really social and they're really friendly and they're really fun to be around. So people will engage on them in a little bit different of a level, and that includes giving them treats. But keep in mind, any treat that they eat is going to decrease the feed that they take in. And that feed, especially when you're talking a layer, is really important for their intended use. So if you're going to do treats, you're going to do just basically maybe some scratch grains, avoid processed food. There's some insects that are sold like mealworms and different things that the birds find appetizing. You can do a tiny amount, but generally at the end of the day is best. That way, you know, they've had their intake of the food that they need to eat. We're actually seeing obesity more in birds now. They are being kept for anywhere from 6 to 8 to 10 years of age into their basically geriatric chicken lives. And if they become obese later in life, they have the same medical problems that humans have, and believe it or not. So layer feed. This is mission critical that when you have birds that are laying, you feed a layer feed because they need that calcium. A bird will continue to lay eggs if she's calcium deficient. If she can't get it from her feed, she'll take it out of her bones. And then you will have a medical problem down the line from a hypocalcemic situation. You would also not feed this to growing birds because that can actually result in rickets, which is a low calcium situation in the bones. And you're saying, Tim, if I'm feeding extra calcium, how do they get low calcium in their bones? And that is because the ratio of calcium to phosphorus, which should be about 2 to 1, is thrown out of whack if you overfeed the calcium, and so you don't get proper bone development. Not as critical if they are completely older and they're set. As long as their kidney function is fine, they can excrete the remainder of the calcium in there. But when they're in lay, they got to have a layer feed, because if not, or if they get too many treats and not enough layer feed, they can actually have medical problems over time. And you don't want to put your bird's health at risk. Mixed flocks. What if you have meat birds in with your layers? I highly recommend you don't have your meat birds in with your layers. And the reason is they're totally different ages, they are totally different diets, and they have totally different purposes. If you have an older layer flock, maybe they're 2 years of age and they're doing fine laying eggs for you still, and you get a bunch of meat birds, those are chicks. You don't want to put them in with the adult birds. The adult birds might have some asymptomatic infections or diseases they're carrying, and you mix a couple flocks together and you get a stressful situation. You can have shedding of that infection, which can affect those baby meat bird chicks to where you could have an outbreak of disease. So housing, this is important. There's 2 really critical takeaways when I talk about housing that I like to stress. There is some average sizes and things that birds need, and where you place it is important. Every picture on the internet, go on the internet and look up some of the bird coops that are out there on Pinterest and things like that. They're nicer than my house. It's amazing what people will build for their birds. Every single bird picture, though, that you see on the internet will show the coop placed up against the neighbor's fence. Don't place your birds as far away from your house and as close to your neighbor's house as possible. make sure that you understand that you want to be a good neighbor when you keep your birds. And then there's two critical things when you're building your housing. One, it has to be cleanable because you need to clean it all the time, right? Think of it as a giant litter box. It's manure. You need to be able to clean that up because that is disease exposure for both you and your birds. If you look at this coop, you see it's got a tiny little door right here, and then you have an outdoor run, and you have your little coop in there. So, raise your hand if you would like to get on your hands and knees and crawl through this run to clean it up and to get in that coop and clean that up. I tell folks, if you make it easily accessible to clean, you'll think about cleaning. If it's really hard to clean, you'll never clean it. So make sure that you build that into your coop when you build it. And then the other thing that is absolutely critical is making it predator proof. When you close up your coop at night and your birds go to sleep, every predator on the planet wakes up and goes and stares at that coop, trying to figure out how to get in there to eat everything in there. Because inside a chicken coop is all the food that everything in the world loves to eat: chicken food, eggs, and chicken. Make sure that they cannot get in there. There is very little more devastating to a poultry keeper than to find a predator has gotten into the flock and has caused devastation in the flock. I talk to people all the time. That drives people out of keeping birds because of the negative impact that that has. If you're going to be doing egg production for longer than just that normal outdoor photo period where birds would come into lay, you can increase your light to 14 to 16 hours to mimic the outside light. They don't need super bright light in there, but a lot of people, if they want to extend their egg harvest season, they will do a little bit of supplemental lighting. Nest boxes, they do like to have that. The same adage goes with nest boxes as goes with coops. If you make the nest boxes easy to clean, you will think about cleaning them. If you make them hard to clean, you won't want to clean them at all. And easy to clean nest boxes are really important because when an egg comes out of a bird, if it falls into clean straw or clean bedding, it's a clean egg. If it falls into poop, it is a contaminated egg. So make sure that your nest boxes are easy to clean because that will make your eggs cleaner in the long run. So here's a picture of a coop I love. And I have this picture up, and we're going to talk about a little bit of housing in the winter. Chickens can tolerate cold. They can't tolerate being cold and wet, right? Livestock outside, they can be cold as long as they're out of the rain and they are out of the wind. They need ventilation, but it can't be drafty, if that makes sense. So here's a rock solid bomb proof coop. It still is right up against the neighbor's fence, like every single coop in the planet, but this one is great. It's got adult size access doors. It's got lots of space in there. It's got a roof that's going to shed rain away from the coop, so it's not going to be wet and seeping back into the run. In the winter, this is great because you want to seal everything up as much as possible, but keep in mind that if you seal everything up super tight for heat scavenging, you might drive that air quality really high in terms of ammonia, which is going to cause potential respiratory problems. And then this is really a common livestock way to ventilate. And you take the plastic from the bottom and you go up. And what that does is it protects against wind at the level of where the birds are, but it facilitates great ventilation across the top, which takes out any of that negative air and allows good air exchange. So we just came out of the winter, but depending on what kind of winters we get, a few winters ago, we had some polar vortexes and we had some serious frostbite issues. A lot of people were calling me, telling me about different problems that they had. In the winter, make sure you're checking your eggs all the time because they can freeze. They're 1/3 water. They can actually freeze and crack open, and then you want to discard them. So lots of different litter choices are out there, and people will use straw, and that's a fine one. People will use pine shavings, and that's a fine one. There are some industry places where they will use sawdust simply because they have tremendous amounts of sawdust. I'm not a huge fan of sawdust. It's really a moisture magnet in the coop. Sometimes those tiny particle size can get ingested by the birds, so I don't recommend that. Unless your management is unbelievable so that you can get it in and out of there really, really quick so you don't get get that moist bedding that has a bunch of manure on it that starts to break down into organic matter with heavy ammonia production. The problem with straw and pine shavings is they used to be cheap and now they're not. They cost a lot of money. It's amazing how much a bale of straw costs anymore and how much a bag of pine shavings cost. These used to be dirt cheap and now they're not. A number of different poultry keepers and a number of different poultry vets that I know recommend construction sand, especially out in the run. Construction sand is not play sand. It's not like beach sand. It is actually, it looks like the bottom of a creek bed. It is particles of all different sizes. You generally have to find this at like a building supply company and you get it in bulk. This is a great product for out in the run. You build up maybe a 4 or 6 inch level of this, and it's kind of like a chicken litter box. When the fecal ball falls out on it, it dries out on top. You can scoop it right up with basically like a litter scooper. Any water that gets into this just drains right through it. It's not organic matter, so it's not going to have the worries that we would have with organic matter, creating that ammonia smell. You can actually poop or scoop this and then take a rake and kind of fluff it up a little bit, and it will last you a long time. It has one drawback that I know, and I wouldn't necessarily use it in a coop, but out in the run, it's a great option to use because it provides great sanitation and it's fairly inexpensive when you get it established. But in the winter, it's cold. I will say that this is construction sand outside, but this is a great option to put in a permanent run because you can decrease disease transmission using this because it's inorganic and it's easily cleanable and it drains really well. So let's talk about eggs. Chickens make about 1 per day. It usually comes out in the morning and it's wet when it comes out. And if you look at the south side of a chicken facing north, you will notice that there is one opening in the back of that chicken and everything comes out of that, that cloacal vent opening. That's urine, feces, and eggs. And so they're going to have some contamination generally. There is a proper wash procedure that I recommend you follow because eggs have pores and you need to match the wash water temperature to the egg temperature to make sure that you don't have a gradient where you're actually sucking bacteria into the egg. And that's important. That's why when you go to a diner and it says on the bottom, we recommend cooking all our meat to a certain temperature and all our eggs to a certain temperature, because once you cook it to that certain temperature, you can make sure that you have killed any potential foodborne pathogens. And then I tell folks, if they come out cracked or they're really dirty and it just doesn't look right, just pitch it. She's going to make another one tomorrow. Okay. This is a great video and I need to pause it because I'm going to share my sound. But this is the virtual chicken from Auburn University, and this is the greatest detailing of the process of how an egg is made.
Brought to you by Auburn University Department
Patricia,
of Poultry
can you hear that?
Science,
Give me
with
thumbs up.
funding provided by Poultry Products, Safety and Quality Peaks of Excellence Program, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
In a hen, an ovary and an oviduct make up the reproductive system that creates an egg. The yolk grows in the ovary, and the rest of the egg forms around the yolk as it passes through the oviduct. Most females have 2 ovaries, but birds are unusual and have only 1. A hen's ovary rests against the back body wall, just to the left of the spinal column. The oviduct begins at the ovary, folds back and forth upon itself, and leaves the hen's body through the vent, just below the tail. The ovary and the oviduct occupy a surprisingly small space within the body of the hen, only a few cubic inches. But when the oviduct is stretched out, it's nearly 2 feet long and has 5 distinct sections: the infundibulum, the magnum, the isthmus, the shell gland, and the vagina. When a hen is actively laying, nutrients from the food she eats are converted into the building blocks of egg yolk. These building blocks, 1/3 protein, 1/3 fat, and 1/3 water, are then carried by the bloodstream from the liver to the ovary. In the ovary, tiny tissue bags called follicles fill with yolk and grow. The largest follicle on the ovary will release the yolk of the egg the hen will lay tomorrow, while the next largest will produce the next day's yolk, and the next largest will yield the next day's yolk, and so on. In 1 to 2 weeks, a follicle grows from less than 1 millimeter in diameter to the mature size of 25 millimeters. When a yolk matures, the follicle ruptures along a line relatively free from blood vessels, the stigma, and the yolk is released. If any blood vessels cross the stigma, a drop of blood may spot the yolk as it is released from the follicle. Called the infundibulum, the funnel-shaped upper end of the oviduct envelops the ovary and catches the most mature follicle as it reaches maturation and ovulates. Then the yolk embarks on a 24-hour journey down the oviduct. When the yolk emerges from the follicle and moves into the upper part of the infundibulum, it's the only time in its progress when it is not covered by a layer of albumin. Fertilization, if it is to occur, will take place here. Some bacterial pathogens, such as Salmonella enteritidis, are able to colonize the reproductive tracts of infected hens. If these bacteria become associated with the developing egg as it passes along the tract, and before it is surrounded by a shell, they can cause disease in a human consumer of the contaminated yolk or albumin. The yolk spends about 15 minutes in the infundibulum before it passes into the magnum. In the magnum, over a period of about 3 hours, it will be covered by a dense, shock-absorbing layer of albumin, or egg white. As the albumin forms around the yolk, spiral ridges which run the length of the magnum cause the yolk to spin like a bullet in a rifle barrel. This spinning twists the protein fibers in the albumin just in front of and just behind the yolk, and makes 2 pigtail-like structures called the chalaza. The chalaza keep the yolk suspended in the center of the albumin, and ultimately prevent it from moving around inside the egg. The magnum gives way to the next section of the oviduct, the isthmus. Here, the shell membranes are deposited. These thin layers of protein wrap loosely around the albumin covering the yolk. It is as though the yolk and its layer of albumin are a blob of jello wrapped with 2 sheets of cellophane. The process does not result in a smooth egg-shaped structure. In fact, an egg leaving the isthmus probably looks more like a prune than a plum. The partially formed egg then enters the shell gland. Here, over the next 20 hours, the shell will form. First, a thin albumin is secreted. This thin albumin is mostly water, and it moves by osmosis through the 2 shell membranes into the highly concentrated thick albumin surrounding the yolk. This plumps the egg into a normal shape and stretches the shell membranes tight around it. Next, a highly concentrated solution of calcium carbonate is secreted by the shell gland, and crystals of calcite form and grow on the outer shell membrane. As the crystals expand, they grow into one another to form a solid shell. Very tiny spaces left in between the crystals leave pores in the shell. Lastly, a special protein solution, called the cuticle, is deposited onto the eggshell. Gas can pass through the proteinaceous cuticle and through the pores in the shell, but the two layers protect the egg from harmful bacteria. Finally, in a process called oviposition, the egg flips end over end. This occurs through contractions of the uterus, synchronized with relaxation of the muscular vagina, and pushes the egg out of the hen's body. An important part of the egg does not form until after it is laid. When an egg is laid, it fills the shell. However, a hen's body temperature is 106 degrees Fahrenheit, and eggs are generally laid into environments that are 20 to 40 degrees cooler. As the egg cools, the inner portion contracts and forms an air cell between the two shell membranes. A chick would puncture and breathe through the air in this cell before hatching. The fully formed egg now begins another journey.
So I love that video because it does 1,000 times better job than I ever could at describing the process of making that egg. But as you can see, that process is pretty involved. A lot of stuff going on that way. A lot of protein needed, a lot of calcium needed, making sure that that layer can make that daily egg. So manure management, right? These are livestock. These are food animal, regardless of if you want to consider it a pet or not. Manure management for all species, livestock, dog, cat, is very important because these various species manures, regardless of species, can have pathogens in them. And so make sure you have a manure management plan. This can be composting it and using it in your garden. Some people simply throw it away. Some people allow other people to take it away, but you want to be cleaning your coop and your run frequently. People ask me, how often do I clean it? And I tell them, think of it like a litter box. You want it out of there as fast as you can get it out of there. Although I understand that not everybody, myself included, cleans the litter box every day. Still, when you do good manure management, you're decreasing bugs, disease, smells, all kind of things that you don't want to have in your poultry production system. So molting, not uncommon. This is something that happens periodically. I get occasional questions about it. This is when a layer who has been in production for a little while has to kind of take a pause. And what happens is they lose their old feathers. Their reproductive system goes back to juvenile. Their comb turns from large when they're in egg production back down to that tiny little comb. They lose a bunch of weight. They look horrible, but this is normal. Keep in mind that at that point, they're going to be out of production. That might be 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks. Then they're going to grow some new feathers. They might be a little bit tender when they grow those new feathers, and then they will come back into production generally at a higher level than when they came out of the molt or went into the molt. So when we look at chicken anatomy, chickens have similarities to mammal species in terms of a bunch of anatomy, but they have several of their organ systems that have profound differences than ours. So we looked at reproductive system that is tremendously different than a mammal system. Their digestive system is also much more different than what we have. Integumentary, they have skin, but they have feathers and they have scales, which we do not have. And then respiratory is another one where they have a bunch of differences. They don't have a diaphragm. They have lungs. They don't expand. They have air sacs. They actually bring air in by physically expanding their entire rib cage, which means if you hold your chickens too tight and you don't allow them to expand their rib cage, they cannot breathe and they can suffocate. So when they eat food, they have no teeth, they peck at it with their beak, and then they take that and they swallow it down. They make saliva. They actually do have a few taste buds. After they swallow the food, it goes into the first spot. That's the crop, which is right sort of here at the base of the chest, at the bottom of the neck. You can actually feel that external because it can be palpated outside of the chicken's body. That's a storage organ. Then it goes into the proventriculus. That's where the enzymes are. And then the gizzard, the ventriculus, where it's grinding organ. That's basically where their teeth are, although it's just a muscular organ with grit inside it. Then it goes out the various intestinal pathways to the cloaca and out the vent. This is a normal fecal ball of a bird or of a chicken. It's got the feces. They don't have urine. They have white urate crystals with a little bit of liquid. Important to know, a lot of people consider chickens to be vegetarians. They're actually omnivores. They eat meat. They'll eat insects just fine. Here's some of the changes that we see when we worry about a chicken's respiratory disease, in that they have a few differences that we had. We talked about lungs and we talked about air sacs, but they also don't have the bony sinus around their face that's complete like our bony sinus. Like if you poke on your cheekbones, they have this is a swollen sort of periorbital presentation in a bird, because without that bony sinus, a lower respiratory infection can migrate to an upper respiratory migration, and then you can have redness, ocular discharge, conjunctivitis, nasal discharge, and actually fairly profound swelling up there. The number one respiratory disease we see in backyard chickens is Mycoplasma gallisepticum. And that is one that we see common even if your birds don't interact with other chickens, because mycoplasma can be carried by any number of species of birds, including songbirds. And so if songbirds can get in and access your chicken's water and feeders, periodically we will see outbreaks of mycoplasma in backyard flocks simply because they picked it up from wild birds. Digestive diseases, we see those fairly common as well in birds, especially coccidia. We looked at a normal dropping. Digestive disease will show up with loose droppings or a paste event, sometimes even bloody diarrhea. Keep in mind that, as I mentioned earlier, chickens are fairly fragile in terms of species. It's not unusual for any number of different diseases affecting any number of different organ systems to simply manifest as acute mortality. They get a bunch of external parasites as well. They'll get lice, they get mites. They have a scaly leg mite that is not uncommon, that affects just on their feet. The most common mite that they get is the northern fowl mite, and that actually can breed in tremendous numbers, usually clustered around the vent in the bird, and then it can get on the eggs. And yes, northern fowl mites will bite people, although we're not their favorite food. They have another mite called a red mite or a roost mite, which is less common. That is nocturnal only. So you'll see signs of mites, but you won't find mites unless you're out there in the middle of the night, because the mites come out to feed on the birds when they're roosting it overnight, and then they go hide in little cracks in the coop during the day. So this is very important. Backyard poultry, chickens are food animals, and they produce eggs and meat, and they contribute to our food security. And if they are put on medications, those medications have to be approved for use in food animals. You work with your veterinarian to develop a withdrawal time, because we have to practice good residue avoidance to make sure that no medications get into our food system. And that's very important to note, because a lot of people will want to treat their birds with things that they see on the internet or medications that they might think that they're able to use, but they cannot, because they're classified as food animal. When I was in private practice, if somebody brought two birds in and those birds had the exact same disease, if one of them was a parrot and the other was a chicken, I had a whole pile of medications I could use with the parrot. I had very few I could use with the chicken, and I had to make sure that I used approved ones that had a calculatable withdrawal time to practice residue avoidance. And then keep in mind, as with pretty much all species, There are things called zoonotic diseases. And what zoonotic means is that disease can be transmitted from species into another species. And birds are no different than any other species. There's a whole bunch of them, and you don't want any of them. So make sure that you're practicing good biosecurity with your birds. Have clothes that you wear when you are cleaning the coop, and make sure that you are not wearing them for other things. Make sure that you are washing your hands, because you don't want to pick up any of these things, and make sure that you realize that there are diseases that pretty much any species, and that's cats and dogs to people as well. You want to make sure that your birds are a source of food, eggs, and happiness, and not a source of disease for you or your family. And on that note, I am done.
Fantastic today, Tim, as always. Didn't expect anything less than that. You're always just super with your information. And
I'm always happy to visit Hawking, both either in person or in the virtual environment.
okay. Well, thanks again, Tim. This was absolutely great. Appreciate it.
My
And thank
pleasure.
you everyone for listening to Hawking Valley Community Hospital's 55 Ways to a Better Me.